All right, we're getting really close. So the next thing we're going to do is remove all the bolts from the drive plate, which essentially decouples the torque converter from the engine. So you will need to be able to crank the engine by hand. So there's an access point right here. That's the direction of rotation. Let me get under there and show you what we're looking at. So in the bottom of the bell housing, here's the oil pan right here. Passenger side wheel right there. Driver's side wheel. There's a cover plate, and then that bolt you're looking at, it's a 17 millimeter. I forget how many there are, probably like eight of them or something like that. Anyway, using the ratchet you have on the crank pulley, you'll rotate this thing around, and for each bolt, remove it. I wouldn't use power tools on this. Do it by hand. If you strip them, you can be in big trouble. So that's all there is to that. I've already got a few of the bolts out. Got a few more to go. It's easy. Alright, so it turned out there was only 4 of those bolts holding the drive plate to the torque converter. So that's done. Now we're ready to move to the top. We need to put the hoist on the engine before we can start splitting the engine from the transmission. If you look here, we got this bracket that's on the transmission side. There's one in the back there on the transmission side. So, and there's one on the top on the transmission side. So we can separate the engine from the transmission and not have the transmission fall. So we need to go up top. All right, so folks, here we are pulling the engine out. Couple things. Obviously, the bolts going around the bell housing, they're a little bit of a problem up the top of the bell housing. Behind that water control module, that one's a little bit hard to get to, but the rest are all easy. They're all 14s. And we got our lift in place. Once we got tension on the lift, we'll remove this engine mount from here. Once we remove the engine mount, we were able to get full separation from the split where the engine's splitting from the transmission. And, that's down in there. And of course, once you get all these bolts out, you should start to see, the separation. And just be real careful. You use a little pry bar to encourage it, but don't break anything. Now we're going to see if we can get the thing higher up. Crank it. Okay, this is definitely not something you're going to want to do by yourself. So my brother's over there working the bar, help keep it from hanging up on the bell housing. Now, we're going to probably have to lower the car off the jacks and use the floor jacks to lower the chassis. So I've got both wheels off. Here's what it looks like on this side. Okay, we did lower the chassis down as low as we could go. Right now it's sitting a little bit on those the brace from the engine hoist, which isn't a good idea because we're going to need to drag it out of there, but we're trying to get our dimensions squared away. And there's the transmission with the torque converter still attached. And those are the 4 bolts you see where we've separated the drive plate earlier. That's what that is. All right, we got it good. We lifted it a tiny bit to clear the engine hoist thingy. Of course, this was to keep the engine hoist from scraping up the front bumper too much. All right, that's it. From this point forward, we'll check in a minute when we are ready to attach the engine to the engine stand. All right, so on the back of the motor, we get the drive plate. These are 17s, and they're 12 points, so you got to use a 12-point socket. I need this drive plate off here because we're going to be taking the crank out. It's only going to make our life more difficult. So now these aren't wear-out items, so it doesn't matter where they go when you put them back in. Okay. Well, the engine's out. Took the oil pan off. No surprise, lots of metal shavings in the oil pan. We already know there's a bad bearing. It's hard to get to the bearings on this. This right here, actually I have to take off this oil pump right there on the bottom of the motor. And it has a gear on it. Don't take that off. Don't disassemble that thing. I ended up taking off the chain tensioner from inside the timing bay. That's really only because I'm going to disassemble the whole engine. If you weren't doing that, then you'd never be able to get the timing chain back on correctly, because all that has to come off. But I want to show you the connecting rods here. So I'm pulling on this guy. I think we found it. I'm going to take that bearing cap and suspect there's no bearing left at all. There's so much movement in there. But we'll see. Give me a minute. Okay, the bearing cap is off, and I found no bearing whatsoever. So, looking at the journal, you can see it's damaged pretty severely, and that's no surprise. It's going to need to be turned, the crank. And there's the bottom of the connecting rod. And there's no bearing in there either. So I'll probably find bigger chunks of it somewhere else in the motor as I fully take it apart, because there's not enough metal in there. You can see it all, though. But there's not enough in there to consist of an entire set of bearings. A couple notable things is the oil, once again, the insides here look pretty good. There's not a lot of burnt oil. Most materials are very clean. So I'm hoping this engine is going to be a good rebuild candidate, which, I'm gambling on that already. So anyway, that's it for today, because the proper sequence for breaking this engine down needs to be followed. You got to get the timing case off. And these engines have this weird thing called a ladder. The engine actually, let me see if I can, hold on. Okay, it's easiest to see when looking at the side. See that line right there? There's a bottom section of this engine that splits away from the block. So this thing is called an engine ladder. And that's why I can't get to the bearings. You can't rebuild this engine in the car, which kind of sucks, because in the old days, you could rebuild an engine in the car. This one, there's no way, because there's no way to separate that. In fact, the way I have this engine mount, this engine stand, I have it hooked to the ladder. I'm going to have to unhook it and move those down. So this is a job for another day. There's a lot of work to be done. End of this transmission. So I got a lot of stuff stripped off here, and things are going good. Just a tip when you're breaking down an engine and you have the opportunity to remove, for example, there's a piece here with a hose there and a hose here. You remove one hose from one side and then from the other, so the other piece has a hose on it. That way you don't mix them up when you're putting it back together. Another thing to hold bolts in place, like here's a bracket. So instead of bagging the bolts, just run a piece of tape around them like that, which makes it impossible to pull them out, and they're all in the right position. And it's easy to remember how to put it back together. Alright, after stripping all kinds of stuff, I'm at the timing case cover. Got all the bolts out. I'm ready to hit it with a mallet, soften it up, get it moving. Let's just take a quick look at some of the things that I've taken off here. Got the intake manifold, the cooling system, the water pump, valve cover, oil pump, power steering pump, belt tensioner system, exhaust manifold. See, I'm taking all these things off as major units. Hyundai did a phenomenally good job with the way they designed these to take it apart. I mean, this is the opposite of BMWs. And there we have the timing cover off. So I'm going to stop for the day. The rest of this stuff, make sure you take several good photos before you take that stuff apart. And follow the proper instructions on how to compress these tensioners and lock them and so forth. So, Yeah, I decided to see if I could get a little farther along and take the head off. And so I took the cams off, take a photo of everything. Funny, there's only one bearing that actually has a replaceable bearing. All these other bearing seats and on the caps, there's no actual bearing. They all show a little bit of signs of wear, but nothing. This one's the only one that shows. You see that ridge right there? That's the only one that shows anything. Let me see what the cam looks like. So there's the race on there's the bearing face on the crank. Oh my gosh, the camshaft. I don't see anything or feel anything bad, so when I prep this for reinstall, I'll use a little steel wool and smooth all these out. Go from there. So, like I said, I can't get the head off because there's a special bolt, special wrench used for that, and I don't have one. Anyway, once I get one, I'll continue on, but I'm almost done getting it apart.